Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. And today we are decoding the beer descriptors. So we have just right now decided that this could be a whole series where we decode beer lingo for you, because we don't also want to be confused alone. So we're going to go through lots of different beer things and the ways that people talk about beer, and we're going to try and simplify them as best as what we can. But before we get into the meat of all of this, let me welcome Lisa and Katie onto the co-hosting table. Hello, friends. It's nice to see you again. And then, as usual, thank you to everybody that has shared posts of ours on social or subscribed or liked to us on all the different podcatchers. We appreciate you massively. And for those who haven't done that yet, it's super easy. Press the subscribe wherever you're listening right now. That includes YouTube, or hit us up on the socials and go follow us there. We're on Twitter, probably mainly. So we're at Beer Ladies Pod. We're at Beer Ladies Pod on Instagram as well. We've even got a new Mastodon. Like, what the hell is that even? But we're on it. So we're on it. And on the TikTok. So we're doing all the things, as well as Facebook, you know, for those who still peruse there. So give us a hit there on the socials and go and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and we would appreciate it. The other thing that we'd appreciate is if you would consider buying some of our merch, because we love it and we think it's really cool. And also, if you'd like our logo on something that's not listed, let us know. We can always make things happen. And the other way to support the podcast is, of course, to buy us a beer. So we're at buy us a coffee or buy me a coffee /Beer Ladies podcast. And all of those links are on any one of our social media bios, as well as in the show notes. So on YouTube or wherever you're listening, you can head through to the show episode and you'll find all the things. Our link tree's got all the stuff. So thanks, Lisa, for setting us up on a Mastodon and keeping us current.
We aim to please. Yeah.
I don't even know what Mastodon is yet, but I'm sure someone will tell me. Someone will tell me what to do.
Still learning here, don't worry. We're gonna have to be like a teaching old dogs new social media tricks kind of gang, because that's where we're at. Okay, so as I mentioned, what we're doing today is we are talking about beer language. Now, we've all been there, right? We've had a beer, or we've heard somebody describe a beer, either, you know, just in passing or during judging, and they use these terms like dank or funky or chewy or crispy. And I think a lot of people take for granted that these words are just understood by everybody equally in all contexts, but that's just not true. And one of the really interesting things is that depending on how you've been brought up or where in the world you've grown up, you know, your association with language and how you use it to describe beer varies wildly. So we thought we might just try and level the playing field a little bit. We brought some terms of our own that we have grappled with, let's say, in the past, but we also asked on Twitter, and we've got a whole bunch of responses. So thank you to everybody on Twitter who responded with interesting words that we hadn't yet put down onto our list. And I figure we'll just go through a few of them and see where we get up. You know, we'll see. Some of us know more than others, and some of us know absolutely nothing about these words. So we'll just go with the flow. Katie's pointing at herself. I can't see.
Yeah, I just drink the beer. I don't describe it.
Fair enough. Okay, well then let's get on to what we're drinking, because I think that all of us will probably be able to get some of these words from what we're drinking and what's on our cans tonight. So Lisa, how about we start with you?
So I'm going for the Rascals Yankee White IPA, which again, already lots to unpack there. What's an IP? What's a white IPA? I mean, we've talked about IPA before and the many permutations and what that could be like. And again, this is a beer I love. I always had this in my fridge because it's just really good as a go-to. So thanks, lads at Rascals, always great beer. But even when I go onto the back, and I'm just going to read it for the folks at home. So we have IPA meets Belgian wit beer and orange peel, unfiltered, unpasteurized, you know, again, a lot of things there. And then just even on the front, sort of citrus plus hazy. And again, you know, if you've been around the block a few times, these all mean, like you're saying, kind of different things to different people. And the funny thing to me is, you know, I really enjoy this beer. You know, again, kind of a go-to for me. And it's funny because I'm often turned off when I see hazy on a can, but in this case, it works. So again, there's a lot about what these words mean in different contexts and all of that good stuff. So, again, lots to unpack there. Even Belgian can mean so many things. So lots, again, sort of festival of adjectives on this beer in a good way, but definitely a bunch to unpack.
Love it. Katie friend, what are you drinking?
I am drinking an IPA from Boundary called It's Time to Be Brave.
Ooh. Cool name.
It is, yeah. Time to Be Brave. And it just says an IPA hopped with Idaho 7, Citra, and Eldorado. Think tropical fruit bowl and sticky pine.
Sticky pine. Okay. Yeah.
Sticky.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there you go. And it's very opaque.
Oh, so it is. Yeah. Folks at home, it's very
can't see anything through that.
Yeah. Interesting.
No way. Yeah. So I'm wondering if this would qualify as chewy. I'm thinking it does. It's quite it's got a lot of body.
Okay. Yeah.
Interesting.
And what are you drinking, Tandy?
I have got speaking of beers that have descriptors, right? I've got Heaney's Tired of Being Wired. It's a dry hopped farmhouse ale with orange. So Heaney are from Derry in Northern Ireland, or just at least somewhere there, I think. Yeah, County Derry. And yeah, so farmhouse beer. And at the back here it says, get wired into this dry hopped farmhouse ale. Amarillo hops and sweet orange peel complement the funky Kvike farmyard yeast, brewed and canned by Heaney.
There you go.
So, farmhouse is always one that I feel like comes up over and over again, and funky, and what is Kvike anyway? So there's loads to unpack here.
Yeah, and I grew up on a farm, and I'm like, farmhouse, that usually just means stuff smells of shite,
That's actually, you know what, that's actually a really good starting point, because
absolutely,
farmhouse is one of these descriptors that you'll see on a lot of different beers, but mostly things like saisons or things that are brewed with Kvike, which is a farmhouse yeast. And so it was a yeast kind of that was used kind of like a sourdough starter, where a little bit was always kind of saved and reused for the next batches. But you guys tell me, so if you're having a saison or something that's got this farmhouse, some of the words that go around these beers are things like horse blanket or funky. You might have Brett in there, but not always. What do these kinds of things mean?
You see, I just want to know who went around licking horse blankets and then tasting beer and deciding that the beer tasted like horse blankets.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great question. And it's funny because, when I did my initial BJCP sort of course and then exam, we were living in Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, you have two different kinds of horsey people, because you have the wealthy horsey people who are off doing their Devon horse show, or who are, training dressage horses or race horses. And then you have all the Amish folk who are, raising their own horses or buying off the track standard breds often. So very different schools of thought, all of those things when it comes to horses. And I feel like just that one definition means something so different to these two different sets of horsey people. And then you take another step back to people who have nothing to do with that kind of thing day to day. And then it gets so divorced from kind of meaning. And to me, and again, I felt like they really hammered on that part in my particular course. Like, we spent a lot of time on horse blanket. And again, to me, it was like sweaty horse, not my thing. And I love horses, but again, not something I necessarily wanted to drink, but other people love that particular kind of complexity. Again, another word that kind of means something, kind of doesn't. But and I know Christina couldn't be on today, but she kind of wanted us to bring up that, some of these things are very kind of rooted in certain social classes, or come from, like the wine world. And how do you kind of unpack what they mean to different audiences without being either sort of condescending or assuming people know exactly what you're talking about? Because I feel like it's such a funny place. But again, to me, it's so rooted in that, like, horsey, different kinds of horsey culture, but equally it's, maybe this is why I don't love those kind of beers. So, or maybe I'm just a Philistine. So could be that. Could be that.
And I think one of Christina's points, and again, she couldn't be here, but we'll get the article that she really wanted to bring this up on this episode. But in the article, the author mentioned things like people who grow up in urban, cities and towns would never really have a concept of something like horse blanket, or what does hay smell like, if you've never really been out rurally. So if we could reframe, or at least add on sort of urban / rural / all the kind of different ways that a flavor might feel and taste to you. And it means that it's slightly more inclusive than just, talking about people who might know what horse blanket smells like. Whereas, like, I love these kinds of beers, and I love them for their exact complexity and their funkiness and all these things. And Katie, I actually think you were asking me when we were in Underdog's reopening. Shout out to Underdog. Yes. Katie was asking me there, can you, what is the difference between something that's had Brett and something that is sour? These kinds of things. And Brett doesn't make beer sour, but it gives it this weird kind of complexity and depth that the only way that I can sort of try and think about it, or the only way that I can get my head around it, is imagine the funk, that smell that you get from like sheep's milk feta, that almost like, it's a bit funky, or goat's cheese. When you taste it, it's got a slight tang, but it's not sour. Or feta has also got like a slight tang, but not sour. And then mix it with something like leather. Imagine a leather book that you haven't seen for a really long time, but without the paper in it, just the leather. I feel like it's something like that. Maybe throw a bit of hay in there, but I'm trying to not be too rural in that sort of description. But kind of goat's cheese or feta cheese, that's what maybe it makes me think of, without the dairy part of it, because it's not that. It's just the slight sourness. It's a tang.
A tang, yeah. No, that's an interesting way to think about it. And again, though, the urban rural divide, I think Dublin accepted, there are a lot of horses in this city. Just that the number I saw this past weekend, just being out and about, I was just like, wow, that's a lot of horses. But again, we are sort of unique in that here. So but I think to me, that like that leather too, that really does, it's such a kind of evocative. You always know what sort of, especially clean leather, smells like, but there's something in there that, whether it's a new pair of boots or something, I think, not everyone has to associate it with the saddle or, tack or something fancy and horsey. It can just be a new bag, new pair of shoes or something like that. Yeah.
This is all making sense to me now.
Are you really? I really, that's
I'm
awesome.
starting to get it. Yeah.
That's so cool.
When you get so it's kind of like leather with a tang.
Yes.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Well, that makes sense to me. It's not going to make sense to someone else.
Yes, it may not to anybody else, but I think that's that's sometimes the way that I think of it. I think people also bring in things like tobacco sometimes, but it's never the only flavor, because you don't necessarily want that kind of almost smoked thing. But I think it's the smoked leaf part of it that's brought in, that's similar to hay. So if you think of hay or straw, it burns and it also dries out. So it's that kind of burnt leafiness that goes with that tang that for me makes up that sort of
and something about, not to get
thing.
into mouthfeel, which is its own thing, but there's also something about kind of the oiliness almost of that, which again could come from so many things. Like your hops can be very resinous, which is different, but there's a continuum of sorts there, just to kind of, again, think about how some of these words maybe fit together, and depending on the kind of beer you're drinking, just kind of have a slightly different emphasis, if you like.
Yeah. So, Katie, give us a word that, give us a descriptor that you've
Well,
struggled with.
What I did was I went through my beer stash and I started picking out some beers. So I have a mountain IPA.
Wait, what's that when it's at home?
In my hand here, called "We Challenge You to a Hop Off," brewed by Salt and Wild Beer. And their descriptors here are: this mountain IPA is inspired by the classic West Coast bitterness and East Coast juiciness. Okay, bitterness, juiciness.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
They're two descriptors.
Those are good words, yeah.
And then it says of some of our favorite American beer styles showcasing Idaho 7, Strata, and leading notes of juicy stone fruit and pine are
Yeah.
followed by a classic bitter finish. So there, juicy stone fruit.
Yeah, which is very specific. I mean, which, you know, could be a plum or, you know, something along those lines. And yet, because I feel like I know what they're going for, but I still wouldn't expect like a plum kind of flavor necessarily. Although they did have, because I was in England last week in York, and they did have the Titanic Plum Porter on, and that is an interesting beer. So that's, you know, a legitimate stone fruit because it's there, you know, in the beer. But it's I do always think that's interesting when it's there as kind of a tasting note, but it's not a physical ingredient. And it's how do you kind of parse those things? Because I think, you know, to a lot of people who maybe are new to beer, or new to kind of getting into this level of detail, and this can come too from you know, the yeast or the kind of hops they're in. People might assume that that's an ingredient in the beer. When you see something juicy, is there juice in it? And especially if the beer comes and is so opaque and so sort of cloudy, you might just assume it is, you know, because you wouldn't know any better if you hadn't dug into it. So
and
Yeah.
I don't understand why they say juicy stone fruit as opposed to like juicy fruit. Why specify stone fruit?
it's interesting too, because I always think of like, if we're talking West Coast IPA, and again, already making a lot of assumptions about what we're saying here. Like I think of that sort of resinous, you know, kind of hoppiness. I think of almost too maybe more of a citrusy kind of a note. I don't personally think of stone fruit.
Me
but
neither.
you know,
Then
equally, I
again,
could see how you might. So
mountain IPAs as an IPA type is also a little bit of an outlier. And I think that something that certain brewers were trying to kind of get right as its own style, but it's very weird because the idea of a mountain IPA is to have the bitter levels of the West Coast and the juicy levels of the New England somehow together in the same beer. Now, feasibly, that could just be an IPA, and we could, you know, have hoppiness and fruitiness and juiciness and all the things in all the different beers. But because we've got this distinction between West Coast being bitter and East Coast being juicy or hazy or whatever the case is, these are all somewhat interchangeable when talking about this style. Having both of them together is called a mountain IPA. I say bollocks firstly. I'm so sick of fake IPA names and fake IPA styles. And that one actually came up on Twitter today, by the way. You know, all these different hyper-local kind of IPA styles. Like who's to keep up with that? And if you haven't already, go listen to our IPA episode because we did rant there a bit.
We did. And you know what? This makes me think too. And probably if we put this idea out into the world, again, we have a habit of this. If we put this idea out into the world, someone may do it. What if people just started putting out completely fake IPA styles and, you know, getting people to kind of rate them, and then someone will eventually make one, even if it's completely pretend, something that's so clearly just, you know, meant to be a parody, but then it will will itself into existence. So just
Probably
be careful. Be careful out there. Yeah.
But back to stone fruits. So stone fruits are typically the fruits like plums, nectarines, apricots. So the ones that have got the big kind of seedy stone in the middle. Now, I'd argue that that isn't so much a descriptor as a family of descriptors, because in what world does a plum taste like an apricot? That's crazy.
And also, would you class an olive as a stone fruit?
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's the question.
And that's a completely different type of flavor than
Exactly
the other stone fruits.
Yeah. So, but when it comes to fruity flavors, like we tend to think about fruits as citrus, and in citrus we've got things like orange, lemon, tangerine, grapefruit, you know, those kinds of flavors.
Pineapple.
Then we've got tropical, where we're really thinking pineapple, mango, passion fruit, maybe guava as well in there. Then we think of stone fruits, so that's apricot, plum, nectarine. Then we have things like apples and pears. I don't know what that grouping is called anymore. Apples, pears, apples and pears, let's call those their own thing. And then you sometimes also get berries. So you might have like a berry kind of note in your beer. I haven't seen many of that unless you've actually put in blueberries or raspberries into your beer. I don't know how many of those flavors can come from a yeast or a hop, but I'm happy to be educated, so do share.
And
But
banana,
those are
you
the,
get banana as well, don't you?
Sure.
Especially
yeah,
in a wit
Yeah, your vice
or
beers.
in a
Yeah.
vice,
or
in
your
a
vice.
vice.
Yeah.
But really interestingly, that doesn't come from the hops, whereas most of these fruit flavors that we're talking about generally come from the hops. Now, when we get into a whole different source of fruitiness in beers, we can talk about yeast-derived fruitiness or esters. And esters is that term for fruity aromas and flavors that come from yeast as opposed to hops. And the most well-known one is banana, and that's in a Weiss beer. So banana in Weiss, orange in a wit, and then you do get some sort of apple, pear, sometimes in like English ales, but also pear quite a lot in Belgian ales. So those are generally linked to the yeast that's used as opposed to the hops that are used, but those are almost kind of like well-known things. It's quite difficult because unless you're learning to be a beer judge or learning how to brew, you might not always understand where the flavors are coming from,
Oh,
even if you're
definitely.
identifying them. So it's perfectly valid to identify tangerine and banana, and yet they come from different places. And, you know, go as deep as you want to on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just the idea of fruitiness, thinking of your example there of like the English ales, some of those can be extremely fruity, but it would be really difficult for me to pinpoint a family of fruit on some of those. It's just again, it's almost kind of the sweetness, which can come from the malt, but is probably coming from the yeast. But, there's a lot there. And again, like you say, you have to know what you're trying to do with that specific style to say, is this right? Is this wrong?
Yes.
It's or do you expect it, do you not? And I feel like there aren't as many of those out there as there used to be, just because everything went IPA, whether it was or not, it was an IPA. But
Yeah.
so that some of those kind of maybe more subtle, hopefully more subtle fruity flavors are kind of less, you just see them less and less, so I think they're harder to kind of pinpoint.
I find certain fruits very difficult to pinpoint. So
Yeah.
plum for me is very hard. I find it to be quite a subtle flavor as it is. Like I love the taste of a plum, but I don't know if I could pick it out in a beer. Apricot, I probably would be able to. Same with pear. I find pear quite difficult to really isolate, whereas apple, I feel like I'd know quite well. It can also be an off flavor though. That's, being green apple can also be an off flavor. So that one is quite sharp and quite fresh in your nose, but some are fairly easy. So smelling grapefruit, is kind of easy to identify and isolate. Orange too.
Yeah, I agree with you on the apricot, especially because it's funny because I do not love an apricot in IRL, but Dogfish Head makes this beer, Apricot hops, and a couple others that are lovely, and they're made with apricot. It's there in the boil, and you get a bit of, again, I would say you get a fruity character, which for those of us listening, I'm air quoting, but you don't get that kind of hit over the head of like apricot, which I would find really cloying, but it's just dialed back enough that like most of it is fermented out. So there's, again, just what I might call a generic fruity flavor. So, yeah.
One last thing on stone fruits. We didn't mention yet prunes and raisins. Now, those ones can be quite easy to identify only because you'll often find them in darker, almost like Russian imperial stouts or barrel-aged barley wines. These kinds of flavors can come from the yeast, but also the malts. And because they're quite high gravity beers, the more sugar that you've, the more sort of sugars that you've added to a beer and the more that's left over there, it kind of promotes esters, which is the yeast is promoting these kinds of aromas. And those ones I find, you can describe quite easily. A plum, not a plum, a prune or a raisin. You get raisin a lot in beers.
Yeah, like you say, and I think especially in a lot of some of the darker Belgian beers, whether it's like a Belgian strong ale or some doubles, you get a lot of that raisin character. And again, like it in the beer, don't want to eat a raisin. So
I'm with you on that one, Lisa.
Yeah,
like
not for me.
Ways. Raisins are all good. Well, here's one that I struggle with a little bit. When we're talking, and my friend Michelle on Twitter said the same thing, but when we're talking about specifically noble, especially German or Czech hop styles, how do you describe these hops that are so, they're in a way, they're so well known for being exactly what they are, that it feels like they don't always have a description. So like a SARS hop, I always think of a SARS hop as quite a spicy hop. But for people who are just drinking a Pilsner every day and knowing the difference between that kind of hop aroma, which for me is sometimes earthy, spicy, as opposed to, let's say, citrusy or tropical, how do we describe those kinds of hops in the best way possible?
Is it
Oh,
slightly herby?
But I mean,
Better?
herbal is such a big family
Yeah.
of things, isn't it? Like what kind of herbs? I don't know.
Yeah, because I almost find with those, I think more about what they don't smell like you were saying, kind of with
Mm,
citrusy or that kind of thing. Or I think about, some of the English hops where you do get things that are much more kind of maybe grassy or again, but earthy again, because I feel like there's a continuum of earthy. But yeah, I feel like spicy is what I always go to thinking about those noble hops. But again, that only means something in kind of in contrast to something else. So I feel like on its own, it's hard to
yeah,
like, I don't know that you wouldn't drink a beer and say, oh, that's spicy.
yeah,
Unless you'd put something else in it. But compared to, like something that was like, hopped with, Fuggles or something like that, very different, very different experience. But again, you have to have that full kind of taste and test to know the
yeah.
difference.
It is one of those things that I think if you're just drinking the beer to enjoy it, I really wouldn't worry about
Yeah.
what all of these things are. Just enjoy the beer. And if you want to start identifying the beers that you tend to like, then it starts to be helpful that you like things that taste like this kind of fruit, or you like things that smell like this, or whatever the case is. But I think that the other really important part about all of these kinds of terms is that they're so relative, and you need calibration.
Yeah.
So when we talk about bitterness, bitterness is not the same as hoppiness. And we've spoken about that before. Hoppiness can mean lots of hops, but it can also mean very low bitterness, as in the case of a New England IPA, where it's juicy and it's all in the aroma and the creaminess, or the mouthfeel and the fruitiness of it, really. Whereas bitterness, you would probably not expect, but a Pilsner is very bitter, but it doesn't have the same kind of bitterness as other kinds of beers. But to be able to calibrate and dial that in, you have to kind of taste a lot of things and try and just look at only one thing. So what is the bitterness in these three beers? Which one is the highest, medium, and lowest? Then maybe which one is the fruitiest, high, medium, low? Then what of the fruity ones, which kinds of fruits do you think that they smell like or taste like? But it kind of takes practice, which is why becoming a BJCP judge or a Cicerone takes a lot of time and a lot of practice, and it's a skill. It's something that you have to continuously hone in on. It's not that intuitive.
Yeah, especially as these styles have changed and evolved as they always have done. I mean, they've never been, sort of static. And I think I saw Pete Brown and some other people talking on Twitter, or maybe RIP. We'll see where we are in a couple of weeks when this drops, or but talking about how people judging what would be a West Coast IPA now being like, oh, it's too bitter, because they've gotten so used to kind of other kinds of IPAs. And like you say, that bitterness then reads very differently if you're not used to either that other version or even, if we go back before that, I think about before you had like Stone being like, oh, so bitter, yay, manliness stuff. But before that, like you had, your IPAs, again, just to pick on IPAs for a minute, weren't that like, they weren't the same kind of bitterness, and then they were super bitter. And then, again, these things kind of ebb and flow, but as these new things come online, how do you stay calibrated? And it can be difficult. And I think too, when we see many, many, many different terms on the back of a beer, like which one do you say, oh, that's the thing I'm looking for? Like it can be challenging if you just want to try something new, and unless you know the brewery and you're like, okay, they're gonna steer me right no matter what. Like it can be a challenge if you're just like, look, beer is expensive now, I want to pick out something for the weekend. How can you kind of again, sort of balance out these different competing terms and know I'm going to like that.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up bitterness and IPA bitterness specifically, because we had a wonderful comment on Twitter from John the Beer Nut, and he said IBUs, as in the International Bittering or Bitterness Units, which is a term that especially during the IBU arms race of, the sort of 90s and early 2000s, everybody was talking about how many IBUs are in your IPA, knowing that humans don't really perceive well above, I think it's 80, but almost nothing above 100, and yet people were claiming to have 120
Right.
IBUs beers. And it's kind of a weird one for me. I feel like that along with dank, which we'll get to in a minute, was just one of these kind of like beer bros sort of language that people used almost willy-nilly. I don't actually think that people always really took it seriously, or themselves, hopefully, but you don't know how bitter a beer is unless you're really tasting it against something that isn't as bitter. So being able to spot a 60 IBU beer on the dot just by taste, without anything before or after, and be accurate every single time, that would be impressive.
Oh yeah.
Then you could
but-
like insure your tongue, like the perfumers insure their nose to get their scent right.
Oh,
You could
absolutely.
be a definite asset
Yeah.
to someone there if
Yeah.
you could do that every time.
But even so, bitterness is one of those things that people perceive quite differently as well. Some people are very partial to it, and some people really aren't.
Yeah.
So, and then you get, like super tasters who will perceive it more vividly, so therefore sooner than what other people would. So, like Lisa over there, the people who are not super tasters would probably be able to handle more bitterness in a beer because they're not tasting it as explosively as what a super taster or a person who's very trained might be able to do. So I actually kind of think it's a little bit of a fuck you to those, guys there in the early 2000s, that you didn't need an 120 IBU beer. You just needed one that was brewed well.
Yeah,
good tasting.
no, it was a marketing thing, and it was, again, it felt very bro-y, and I feel like, again, my own personal view, I feel like that's where that kind of came in, because I feel like it wasn't there in the same way before that. But I mean, again, like, bitterness is such an interesting thing, because speaking as a super taster, I'm great with bitterness in beer, great with bitterness in chocolate, can't stand the kind of bitterness that comes like with coffee, or there's just like a completely different genre of bitterness there for me. Or even like again, I know we're going to talk a little bit about bitter sour, but some of some of those things, some of them I love and others cannot do. So it's so, there's so many gradations in each of those things that it's it's a tricky one, even if you're trying to do it on purpose, which I'm not convinced everyone was trying to do that on purpose at first, but here we are.
Yeah. So Katie, tell us about bitter and sour.
Well, apparently bitter and sour are different things. Who knew? Who knew? Who knew? No, we were chatting about this, and the Irish word for bitter is sharav, and I believe the Irish word for sour is sharav, and the Irish word for like acidic is sharav, which is the same word. So I'm just thinking that I never learned to differentiate properly between bitter and sour, or something that's slightly acidic. It was just all grouped into the one descriptor for me, possibly when I was growing up. And because anything that's sour, it's just sour to me. I haven't figured out how to unpack sourness at this stage.
Yeah.
I think I've started to figure bitter out, I will say, but I think they're used interchangeably a lot in the Irish vernacular, unless you know what you're talking about. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And like we were talking before, that especially all those of us who have kids who are growing up in Ireland, they see them as one thing, even if they're not necessarily native Irish speakers. So how much of the there's this sort of almost sort of phantom influence of the language on how people perceive these different kinds of tastes. So again, we would love to hear from more people and dig into this. And, I'd love to see if maybe like Mother Folklore or someone out there has a view on just, are there things that are perceived differently in Ireland because there was maybe one or totally separate Irish words for something? Because we certainly see that in like how Hiberno English works. So does it filter through to how people taste things? I suspect it does. So.
I suspect it does. My son, who is 12, confuses or conflates bitter and sour all the time. So, you know, whenever we're talking about whatever food or drink we're having, you always say, oh, it's so bitter. We're like, no, it's not. It's, you know, it's sour. That's what you're, you know, or it's acidic, or it's tangy, or it's tart, or it's, you know, something. And he's like, nope, it's bitter. That's just it. You know, and that could be like lemon meringue tart, which is not bitter by any means.
No.
At all.
And then it's like, even within things like that, you can get descriptors that are kind of like a little bit negative, slightly negative, and ones that are positive. So someone wrote a thesis on terminology in beer reviews, and we'll link it. But they just did one on acidity, and I'll just read it out. So too much or negative is sour, acidic, sharp, hard, biting, or pricked. Whereas the right amount is tart, crisp, piquant, lively, zestful, and tangy. And when it's too little and negative, it's flat, bland, and flabby.
Oh.
That sounds dreadful.
So even within one little group, there's so many ways to describe the same thing in different language that doesn't really, they're adjectives rather than descriptors, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And how much of this, so it's fascinating. Again, like how much of this comes from, again, either wine tasting or, you know, because I feel like on the beer side, we have a lot in common with like how people describe whiskey. Just again, we're both starting with something that's a grain. And so, you know, going from there, but then it does kind of veer off in other directions. I mean, they get very leathery right away, which of course that completely makes sense. But I do wonder though, too, do we have all of these things that are really meant to be words for describing something that's really from a fruit, like thinking about wine, and does it maybe just not fit? I don't know.
It's really interesting. The whole the studying of the language used in descriptors of both aroma and mouthfeel and flavor. It's interesting.
Yeah. And then you go and absolutely, and then you go and you look at Untappd, and kind of there are value judgments assigned to things that, again, so dank over on Untappd is, you know, the best thing you could possibly say about certain categories of beer. Whereas again, I know we were going to circle back to dank, that, you know, to me, I'm still like, it just feels like a very negative word to me, again, because I'm probably too old to be like down with the cool kids who were like, it's so dank. Because to me, I'm like, this is something kind of moldy or damp, and, you know, not my thing.
So is that what it evokes for you? Something like moldy and damp?
Yeah, which I know is not what they're trying to convey with it, because it's very hip and dank, and, you know, but I don't think of a clean kind of taste. I'll say that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Katie, what do you think of when you hear dank?
When I hear dank, I think of, so I grew up in the whole bootcut jean generation. And when we used to go out and it was raining, your legs would get all wet. And you'd leave your jeans in the corner of the room, and I just thought they smelled dank the next morning.
Yeah.
That's what I get when I think of dank.
See, again, there's this sort of, I'm going to say the words right. Sorry, everyone. Moist kind of character, and I'm not here for it. For people, that's good, but
moistness.
It's not for me. It's not for me. And again, so it may be a good beer.
Border of musty for you, is that almost a synonym then? Which
again, I think can have both kind of positive and negative connotations, thinking in like the wine world. But again, not for me, because I'm not a wine person. But I know you can have like a good, like musty, like a sherry or something, but you can also have a bad, very bad one. So it's maybe it's one of those terms that has, again, kind of a spectrum, you know, depending on how you use it.
I don't know where dank came from, but the way that I've always understood it, or the way that I've always visualized it, put it this way, is something like a wet pine forest floor. So it can't be the leaves on the tree that are wet. It's got to be on the floor where they've been squished a little bit. And there is a little bit of dampness to it, but that's not the prevailing feeling for me. The prevailing feeling is that slightly woodsy, piney, pine needles, but slightly squished and wet and a little bit old. But
we're selling it.
We are definitely selling it. But it's funny because what I think I used to like beers that were, traditionally called dank, these kind of
Yeah.
big West Coast IPAs. And I mean, firstly, to your point, Lisa, I don't know actually how big they would be now,
Yeah.
compared. But at the same time, we hadn't had a more balanced approach to beers besides non-IPAs. And certainly we hadn't had all these different other styles of IPAs. But I don't know now. I think that now if I have something that is too much like that, it feels as if it is grassy and green to me, but not in a fresh cut way. It just feels like it's, I don't know, like I'm suffocating in a bag of old leaves or something.
Oh my gosh. I love that we have sort of slightly different perceptions of it all around, but we all agree it is wet and has been trod upon. Like that,
Yes.
we are all there for
Yes.
that. But I think you're right. That's such an interesting perspective because again, I love what I think of as an old school West Coast IPA, but again, to me, that's also very fresh, has kind of a sort of snap to it. Again, the green is a different kind of green to me. So, but that's really interesting. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we've had so many of these other things. And again, to me, when I think of like that a beer is going to be dank, I think it's going to be maybe really, have some of those sort of resinous hops, but also have that, that almost lactic or, that sort of soft, again, it's going to be opaque, maybe look like a juice. And
Really?
so I feel like I'm going to miss, I feel like I see a lot of beers described as dank that have like old school West Coast hops, but are a hazy IPA. So again, maybe those are just the ones I've happened across. But I will say I bought one recently. I'm not going to say where it was not in this country. And it was described as, old school West Coast IPA, and I could not see through it. And I was like, and it said it was dank. So again, I may just be scarred by that one beer, but
I don't know. I would always think dank was far more West Coast.
Yes, me too.
Than hazy, and it's like you look at it and it will be slightly syrupy looking. I don't know how to describe that. That's not the word resiny. That's the word, isn't it?
Resiny. Yes, it's resiny. And remember those old school West Coast IPAs, they were often quite alcoholic, so 6.5+%. They were sometimes like really amber color, and they almost made it seem resiny, as well as being really bitter, really like dank with that kind of pine resin kick at the end. And what I think always got me, or maybe this is how I understand dank, but it didn't finish bright. It finished like bitter low, and not in a bad way. It just meant that it didn't finish like, oh, I want more. It always felt like a sipper, to me. Whereas Crispy Boys, there's another one that we're going to bring up, to me always feel like, clean, have another one, easy drinking. Whereas these kind of dank IPAs were always West Coast and always, dripping in resin, and they were slightly sweet too. So, it added to it. There was a sweetness and a weird pine resin hoppiness, and they were quite, well, boozy is not the right word, but quite heavy.
But I think there's something about that kind of, again, oiliness, whether it's a real one, like coming from either the hops or something else, or just perceived. Yeah, I think there's something about that where it just, it gives it that extra, again, maybe heaviness is the right word. Yeah.
I really don't know what the right word is, so.
But we could create one and
we could
market the hell out of it. Yeah.
All of these words are being created by someone, so why not us?
That's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to like start creating all these words and brew a beer.
Beerladies dictionary.
Yeah. And then see who starts. We have to monitor usage.
Yeah, see where it takes off.
See which ones pick off, which one are trending,
Yeah.
Katie, the data analyst, is salivating.
I love this. Absolutely. Getting those CVS files out of Untapped and being like, okay, CSV files, CSV files coming out, and we're analyzing. Yeah.
So then potentially the complete opposite of dank, what do we think of as crispy? And what do we think of that word?
Yeah, it's like, how is something crispy? It's crisp. Is it crisp or is it crispy? Oh God, I don't even know. I think a flavor is clean. I think of it as clean and refreshing.
Yeah. I'll
But
confess, I love the term crispy boy. I just think it's fun. Yeah.
So I think it did come from crisp. So,
Yeah.
these kinds of pilsners and lagers that are, clean, refreshing. For me, they often evoke something that's got a slightly more of a bitter bite at the end, because there is something about that, just that dry bitterness. I mean, dryness and bitterness are not the same thing again, but that dry bitterness that you can sometimes get from a lovely pilsner, which just tastes like, that's the shit. Like that's the one I want, and I want more. I don't actually mind the term crispy boys, although I think it's just become the new dank.
The new dank. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
because I think crisp and crispy are two completely different words, and they don't mean
Yes.
the same thing. And crispy
Yes.
is like cornflakes. Well, they're more crunchy. Rice Krispies, in the morning. They're crispy. Or when you're walking on your autumnal leaves, they're crispy. Whereas crisp is something completely different.
Although it is funny, because besides your autumn leaves, you did bring up two foods that are grain based, and that's kind of synonymous with lagers and pilsners. Well, all beers, but that's really the prevailing flavor. So maybe.
But here's a question now, because I feel like when I see something described as a crispy boy, it's always, I'll say almost always. I don't want to be, write them off completely, because again, I love them. I think they're great, and I completely agree about that kind of dry, moorish character. But how dark does a lager have to be before it's not a crispy boy anymore? Is an amber lager, can it be a crispy boy? But would a Schwarzbier be a crispy boy? I feel like it might not be. So
I don't think so.
is it the color? Is there
Interesting.
something just about as it gets toasty, or is it no longer crispy? Again, I don't know, because again, I think of, that they're both styles I love, but I don't think of them as that, crispy kind of character. So
I agree.
where does crispy change? I don't know.
I have no
I think
idea.
it changes. It goes from fest beer, and it like that's the end of it. So by the time you get into Märzen or Vienna lager, then you're out of crispy boy territory.
Maybe that's it. That said, though, what if you get, like a Mexican lager that's a Vienna lager, and you put the lime in it? Can it still be a crispy boy? But again, they can get darker, they can get a little sweeter, certainly, which again, I think once you're beyond some sweetness level, maybe it's not a crispy boy anymore. So I don't know if it's the color or the sweetness that's kind of the, what tips it over, but something in there.
Can we call a cold IPA crisp?
Oh,
Can we call a cold IPA an IPA? Is it another makey-uppy name?
Oh,
for those listening at home, Tandy is just no, shaking her head, rolling her eyes.
This is my pet peeve. This like sticking IPA onto the end of every damn beer style. But now the thing is, people who have had cold IPAs do say that they taste different. I maintain that they're just IPLs, which also shouldn't really be a style, except with the addition of kind of, sometimes rice and corn to change the grist a little bit. But I don't know. I haven't had one, so I'd like to try one. Or I will begrudgingly try one.
Well, yeah, maybe someone will make a really good one that we are on board with. Just saying,
but then
it could happen.
Here's the promise: if we do find a cold IPA, I think what we need to do is have KT's Mountain IPA, a cold IPA. We need to find an IPL, and we need to do like a West Coast, East Coast. We need to do like and your white IPA, and we just need to have a little IPA spectrum test, so that we can figure out whether these are actually distinct styles or not.
Oh, and a British IPA, like.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We
It's
need
English IPAs, yeah.
This is an episode already. We're going to do the IPA taste off.
Oh my gosh. IPA is version 2.
Yeah, I feel like someone is going to need to like partner with us and brew some beers. And so if anyone's, got all this tank space, let us know. We'll help you out.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I think we've now done quite a lot for those listening and watching at home in terms of these beer descriptors. But how about we do some more of these and keep decoding this kind of language? Would you guys at home like that? Do tell us, see if you find it useful, and send things our way, because we can just every now and then pop one of these episodes into your ears and all learn together as usual.
Yeah, we want to hear pet peeves. We are here for it. We want to decode, but if there's something we're just like, no, never, we want to know why.
Yes, absolutely. But is there any parting thought or final adjective laden sort of descriptive sentence that anybody wants to share with our listeners?
I think everybody just drink beer that you like. You don't have to describe it. You just have to like it, because beer is for everyone.
Oh, that's a great point. And I'll add a note maybe to keep people thinking about this for another time. I'm just going to say astringency. So many things within that. Again, we would not be able to cover it all today, but that's just one word to just kind of get people thinking, like, how many different things could that mean? And again, that's just one, but I think we'll save that one for a future episode and start to unpack some of these other things that people like to nerd out about, but do they really mean anything? Do they add to the experience when you're buying things? I think that's really something we'd love to know. Like, do these terms help you, not help you when you're kind of staring at a tap list? That's really the, the ultimate question.
I want to add one more in terms of what helps or maybe doesn't help. We've been calling for years for cans to tell us what hops go into things. And we love it when people list ingredients, because it's really good. But you know what I'd love to see is listing things like Idaho 7. What flavors should we expect from Idaho 7? Unless you're a brewer, you don't really know that it's known for its tangerine, as opposed to different kinds of hops that lend an earthiness or a floral note. So wouldn't it be fun if, for those people who are listing, hops in the cans, people might be able to find beers that they like based on that hop alone, if you just give it one of these, descriptors that we will all argue about later. Yes, that's a parting thought.
Hear, hear.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining the Beer Ladies again this week, and a shout out to everybody that has bought some merch or bought us a cup of coffee / a beer. We love to see it, and we'll see you all on the socials. Lisa will be sharing all the Mastodon news, I'm sure.
It's coming.
And giving us all a crash course in what we need to do to.
I only signed up 6 years ago and started using it properly this past week, so I will learn it all by the time this episode drops. So there we go. I promise to all our listeners.
Experts in the house. So if you are leaving the Twitter, please go and follow us on Mastodon so that we don't lose you. And otherwise, we'll see you on Twitter at beerladieспod, same on Instagram, pretty much the same on Facebook, and on TikTok as well, because we like to share snippets of our episodes. So there is that. All right. See you next week, everybody. And thank you, co-host friends. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.